Vin Diesel walks into his restaurant in secret, then freezes at the sound of a crying server. What would you do if you walked into your own restaurant and heard one of your employees crying behind a closed door? Not from stress. Not from a bad tip, but from fear, real fear. Vin Diesel didn't just hear it, he felt it. And what he did next changed everything. This isn't a story about fame, it's about power, silence. And what happens when a black man refuses to look the other way? You're not ready for what he found. But you need to hear it. The stranger in the shadows. A famous black star walks into his own restaurant, only to hear the sound that shatters his heart, a young woman crying. What he discovers next will change everything, and he's not walking away this time. The city of Los Angeles shimmered under the Friday night lights, but inside TORX, Vin Diesel's restaurant tucked in the heart of downtown, the glow felt warmer, quieter. Romantic lighting painted soft gold over polished tables. Laughter floated between bites of seared steak and glasses of red wine. To most, it looked like perfection. But Vin knew better. He entered without an entourage, just a hoodie, jeans, and the weight of someone who'd seen too much behind closed doors. No one recognized him at first. He liked it that way. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to see. Vin had built TORX from the ground up, not as a vanity project, but as a space where both everyday workers and Hollywood elites could feel at home. But the truth of any business, he'd learned, wasn't in profits. It was in the silence between shifts, in the way employees walked, talked, and whether they dared to breathe around their bosses. He made his way through the crowd slowly, soaking in the mood. On the surface, everything was polished. Plates clattered, couples laughed, but Vin felt it, an undercurrent of something tense. Eyes that avoided, smiles that didn't reach. He spotted the manager near the host's stand. Tall, clean-cut, arms folded like a bouncer outside a nightclub. The kind of presence that didn't monitor but dominated. Even from across the room, something in the way he stood rubbed Vin wrong. As he approached the bar, that's when he heard it, barely there. A sound hidden beneath jazz music and silverware. A muffled cry, soft and desperate, bleeding from the hallway near the kitchen. Vin slowed. The door to the break room was slightly open. Inside, a young woman, head bowed, hands clutching the metal counter, shook with quiet sobs. Another employee stood beside her, speaking gently. Vin couldn't see her face, but the pain in her posture was unmistakable. "You can't let him do this," the young man whispered. "He doesn't own you." "I don't have a choice," she replied, voice shaking. "He said if I don't do what he wants, I'm gone." Vin's chest tightened. He had worked restaurant jobs in his early days. He'd scrubbed dishes until his hands cracked, served tables where he was tipped less because of his skin. But this was different. This was fear, not from the job, but from someone inside it. He took a seat at the bar, masking his thoughts behind calm eyes. The bartender offered a smile. "Water's fine," Vin said, but his focus stayed on the hallway. Moments later, the young man from the break room returned to the floor. Nervous energy clung to his shoulders. He fidgeted with his apron, adjusting a notepad that didn't need fixing. Vin stood up and approached him at the server station. "Hey, man," Vin said quietly. "Got a pen?" The young man looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah, sure." He handed it over. Vin glanced at the name tag, Tyler. Tyler nodded. "I saw your friend, she okay?" Tyler paused too long. "She's fine," he said, voice too quick. Vin's gaze didn't waver. "She doesn't look fine." Tyler swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the manager across the room before dropping again. After a tense moment, he whispered, "She's not." Vin didn't press. He didn't have to. The fear in Tyler's voice spoke volumes. "How long she been working here?" Vin asked. About a year, Tyler replied. Then, as if regretting the openness, he looked away. She needs the job. Vin understood. It wasn't just stress, this was survival. Too many like her didn't speak up, not because they were weak, but because they couldn't afford the cost. The air shifted. Footsteps approached from behind. "Everything okay over here?" The manager asked, voice smooth but firm. Vin turned slowly to face him. Mid-40s, crisp shirt smiled too sharp. His name tag read Rick Calloway. Vin kept his voice neutral. "Just getting a pen." Calloway clapped Tyler's shoulder a little too hard. "Good, let's stay focused." Tyler nodded quickly and turned away, jaw clenched. Calloway lingered. His eyes studied Vin, not recognizing him. Vin didn't flinch, he didn't need to. He'd seen men like Rick before, men who thrived on quiet control and feared exposure more than anything. As Rick moved away, Vin stepped outside for a breath. The air was cool against his skin, but his thoughts burned hot. Emily, he didn't know her name yet, was still inside, still under that man's thumb, and now he knew for sure something was wrong in his house, but he wasn't walking away, not tonight. The cry behind the door shattered everything. Vin Diesel knew fear. He'd seen it growing up, seen it in the eyes of friends who got pulled over too many times, in mothers holding their sons a little tighter at night. But this fear, the kind trembling behind a break room door in his own restaurant, cut deeper. He had to know more. As he stepped back into TORX, the warm hum of laughter and music felt almost dishonest. People sipped cocktails. Plates clinked, but for someone like Emily, whose name he still didn't know, this place wasn't soft or golden. It was a trap. Vin moved through the room with quiet purpose, his eyes scanning. The manager, Rick Calloway, had drifted back to his post near the front. Still watching, still in control. And the employees, they moved quickly, but something in their steps felt rehearsed, like people surviving, not working. Vin saw Tyler again at the server station, stacking plates, trying to disappear into routine. Vin approached, low voice calm. "You said she needs this job," Vin said. "Why?" Tyler looked around before answering. "Her mom's sick. Bills are piling up. She's all they got." Vin exhaled through his nose, jaw tight. That explained the desperation. Emily wasn't crying over spilled drinks. She was carrying more than one paycheck could hold. "Has he done this before?" Vin asked. Tyler hesitated. His fingers trembled slightly as he arranged utensils. "Not like this, but he singles her out, keeps her late, always makes her feel watched." Vin's eyes narrowed. "What about the others?" "No one says anything," Tyler whispered. "Everyone's scared. He has friends in upper management. People talk about HR, but nothing happens." Before Vin could respond, Calloway appeared again, quiet and sudden like a shadow that moved when the light shifted. "Still chatting?" he said, tone smooth but stiff. Vin straightened slowly, his expression unreadable. "Just checking on the service." Calloway smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. "We're doing fine tonight, no complaints." Tyler stepped back instinctively. The tension in his body screamed submission. Vin didn't say a word. He let the moment breathe, let the silence do the talking. Then he nodded. "Good," he said. "Because the moment something feels off, people notice." Calloway didn't respond. His jaw worked quietly as he stared at Vin just a little too long before walking away. Vin watched him go. He knew what he had to do next. Outside, under the glow of the back alley lights, Nate, the bartender from earlier, stood with a vape pen and a tired look. He was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Vin approached casually. "Long night." Nate looked up. Then his eyes widened slightly with recognition. "Wait, are you?" Vin raised a finger to his lips. "Not tonight, just here to ask a question." Nate laughed softly. "Sure, what's up?" "What do you know about your manager?" Vin asked. Rick. Nate's smile faded. Strict, real strict, always on us, but... He stopped looking around. But what? Vin pressed. Nate lowered his voice. Emily, he's got this thing with her, keeps her after everyone leaves. Makes her do side work no one else does. And the way he talks to her, it's not right, man. Has she ever said anything? No, but she doesn't have to. Nate's voice cracked a little. She tenses up every time he calls her name. That ain't nothing. Vin nodded. Thanks for telling me. I've wanted to say something for months, Nate admitted, but I didn't think anyone would listen. Vin placed a hand on Nate's shoulder. You just did. As Vin re-entered the restaurant, the mood inside felt even heavier. He saw Emily again. Her face composed, her hands steady, but her eyes distant. Hollow, she was speaking to a couple at table 6, smiling through pain. He walked toward her. Excuse me, he said softly. Emily turned, startled. Yes, sir, can I help you? I need a moment. I'm with a table, she replied quickly. It's important, he said gently. The customer started to protest, but Vin's voice stayed calm. She'll be right back. Emily followed him a few steps away, her apron clutched like armor. What is this? She asked. Vin's voice softened. I heard you earlier. I know something's wrong. Emily looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't have to say anything, Vin said. But I need you to know you're not alone. Her eyes welled slightly, then blinked it back. I can't. He said if I talk, I'm out. You can, Vin said, because he's not untouchable. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The way her shoulders trembled said it all. And in that moment, Vin made a silent promise. He wouldn't just hear her, he would fight for her, even if it meant tearing his own place apart. The man who thought he could control fear. The man in the navy blue shirt watched like a shadow that never blinked. Rick Calloway stood by the hostess stand with arms crossed, scanning the room as if every face belonged to him. Control wasn't just something he demanded. It was something he wore like cologne, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Vin watched him too, but not with fear, with clarity. Emily had returned to her table. Her hands moved with precision, her voice professional, but her spirit, Vin could see, was still curled up in that break room, gripping cold metal, trying not to break. Vin didn't move toward her again. Not yet. He had learned something long ago. When a man thinks he owns the room, the most dangerous thing you can do is take your time. He stepped toward the bar instead and signaled for Nate, the bartender. When Nate approached, Vin leaned in and spoke low. I need to talk to you, outside, 1 minute. Nate didn't question it, just nodded. Moments later, the two stood beneath the glow of the alley light again. The sound of music and laughter from inside muffled by brick and steel. Vin asked straight, no softening. What else has he done? Nate looked down, then met Vin's eyes. He makes her stay late, always finds a reason. Cleaning, counting tips, nonsense. She's the only one he does that to, and every time she comes out, she looks smaller. Vin clenched his jaw. Has anyone reported him? Emily won't, she's scared, the rest of us, we just survive. Nate hesitated, then added, we all see it, man, we've seen it. But nobody wants to be the first one through the door. Vin nodded slowly. You just were. Back inside, Vin didn't sit. He walked the floor like it was his home, because it was. But tonight, it felt like a stranger had been living in his house. Emily was now at the POS screen, tapping in an order. Her fingers moved quickly, but her shoulders were still tense. Vin approached, his voice steady. Can I speak to you privately? Emily looked up, startled. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the room, toward Rick. I can't, she whispered. Yes, Vin said, you can. She stepped away slowly, leading him toward a quieter corner near the back. I told you already, she said, voice tight. I can't say anything. I've tried before, but he made it clear. If I make trouble, I'm done. Vin looked at her gently. You're not the problem, Emily, he is. Her name on his lips stopped her cold. I didn't tell you my name, she said, barely audible. No, Vin said. But I've heard enough tonight to know I needed to find out. Before either of them could speak again, a figure appeared. Rick Calloway. His presence fell like cold rain. His voice was smooth, but there was a tightness under it. Is there a problem here? Emily took half a step back, not because she wanted to, because her body reacted before her mind did. Vin didn't turn immediately. He let the moment hang. We were just having a conversation, Vin said finally, eyes still on Emily. Calloway's smile was thin, stretched. Emily's got work to do. Private conversations aren't on the schedule. Emily flinched at the word, private. Vin turned, slowly now, fully facing him. I think, Vin said, voice calm but heavy, this conversation needs to happen. Rick raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. Vin reached into his back pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and flipped it open. Inside was the ownership credential. Emily gasped softly. Rick blinked, confused, then pale. My name, Vin said, is Vin Diesel, and this place, it belongs to me. The dining room, full just moments ago with laughter and low music, seemed to fall silent. A server dropped a glass. Someone whispered his name. Calloway didn't speak, he didn't have to. Vin's voice lowered, almost gentle, but cutting through the air like a blade. And you and I were going to talk. For the first time that night, Rick Calloway looked like a man who had lost his grip. Vin Diesel confronts the man who abused his power. Rick Calloway stood frozen, the weight of those 4 words crashing down on him like a stone. My name is Vin Diesel. He blinked, tried to speak, but nothing came. The once confident manager now looked like a man cornered by something he couldn't manipulate. Vin didn't wait for a response. He nodded toward the back. Your office, now. Rick hesitated, scanning the restaurant, perhaps hoping someone would intervene. Someone would rescue him from the truth that was finally dragging him into the light. No one moved. Even the servers, who had spent months walking on eggshells, stood silently, eyes wide, watching what many had only dared to imagine. Rick straightened his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, this way. The hallway to the office was narrow and dimly lit. Each step echoed like footsteps in a courtroom. Rick walked ahead, his shoulders tighter with every step. Vin followed without a word, his face calm but his presence undeniable. Inside the office, Rick reached for his chair, but Vin stopped him with a look. Don't sit. Rick's hand froze midair. Vin stepped forward, placing both palms on the edge of the desk, leaning in just slightly. You've been abusing your position, he said, voice low and razor-sharp. You've made a young woman feel afraid, isolated, like her job depends on keeping quiet. That's not true, Rick said quickly. You've got it wrong. Vin stared him down. I've been in this business long enough to know when a man's lying and when a man's cornered. Rick tried again. I'm just firm, I expect standards. She's emotional, she misinterprets things. Vin pulled out his phone. Pressed play. Emily's voice spilled into the room, soft and broken. If I don't do what he says, I'm gone. Then Tyler's voice, panicked but brave. You can't let him, he doesn't own you. Rick's face drained of color. He stepped back, reaching for words that weren't there. Vin locked eyes with him. You preyed on her, you used power like a weapon, and you thought no one would ever notice. I didn't, I mean. No, Vin interrupted. You did. And you kept doing it, because no one stood up to you until now. He tapped the screen again, this time dialing. Who are you calling? Rick asked, panic now creeping into his voice. Corporate HR, Vin said. You're finished. Rick's lips moved, trying to form a protest, but nothing made it out. You'll never work in this industry again, Vin said. Not after tonight. Rick stood motionless. His carefully built empire, his dominance over the vulnerable, collapsed in seconds. Vin turned without another word and walked out. When he re-entered the dining room, every eye turned toward him. The room had gone still, like everyone had stopped mid-step, mid-thought. He walked straight to Emily. He's gone, Vin said softly. You're safe. Her hand slowly lifted to her chest, as if to make sure her heart was still there. Her breath caught, then released in a long, trembling exhale. For the first time all night, her shoulders dropped. Behind her, Tyler stood speechless. Nate wiped his hands on a towel, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Other staff peeked out from the kitchen, eyes wide with disbelief. Vin turned to them. You've been working under a man who didn't deserve your respect or your silence, he said. That ends today. Emily looked at him, voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Vin smiled gently. You tell me. And for the first time in a long time, she stood tall. Not because someone told her to, but because she could. The doors that close, the doors that open. The office door closed behind them with a weight that seemed to silence the entire hallway. The noise from the restaurant faded into a low hum, like a world that no longer mattered. Inside the small room, the air was stale. Stacks of invoices sat untouched. A wall clock ticked with eerie calm. Rick Calloway stood near his desk, arms stiff at his sides. He wasn't pretending to be in control anymore. The look in his eyes had changed, from confident to cornered. But Vin Diesel, standing just feet away, was as still and calm as a man could be. Vin didn't sit. He didn't need to. You know why I'm here, he said, his voice steady low. Rick's mouth twitched. I didn't realize. That's the problem, Vin cut in. You didn't realize who was watching, because for too long no one has. That changes tonight. Rick tried to recover. Look, maybe there's been a misunderstanding. She's been emotional lately, and... Vin's stare cut him off mid-sentence. Stop. There was power in that word, said without shouting. Rick took a breath. I run a tight ship, that's all. Expectations. Standards. Some employees can't handle pressure. I never meant. Vin reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped play. From the speaker, Emily's voice filled the room, fragile, tired. If I don't do what he says, I'm gone. Tyler's voice followed, shaken but clear. You can't let him, he doesn't own you. Rick froze, his face turned gray. Words fled his mouth, but none formed. You've been cornering her, threatening her. Using your title to manipulate someone who couldn't afford to walk away, Vin said. You made her believe silence was survival. I didn't say that to her. That could mean anything, Rick stammered. Vin's voice dropped even lower. You made her cry in my restaurant. The silence afterward was loud. Then Vin dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. Who are you calling? Rick's voice cracked. Corporate HR. No, please, Vin, listen. I didn't mean any harm. This will ruin me. You ruined yourself, Vin said. I'm just making sure no one else suffers from it. A calm voice answered on the line. This is Monica with HR. Vin spoke clearly. This is Vincent Sinclair. I'm reporting an urgent case of employee abuse at TORX. The general manager, Rick Calloway, is to be relieved of all responsibilities immediately. I'll provide all supporting evidence and witness statements. I'll also oversee the internal audit myself. Rick stood motionless, his face drained of color. He looked like a man who just watched the door to his entire life slam shut. Vin ended the call. He looked Rick in the eye one last time. You won't do this to anyone else, ever again. Without another word, he turned and opened the office door. Out in the dining room, the quiet tension was still thick in the air. Every employee had stopped pretending not to notice. Some leaned against walls, others stood behind counters. Emily stood near the bar, her hands shaking slightly. Vin stepped into the room. "It's done," he said. Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" "He's gone," Vin replied. "You're safe." She stood still, processing his words. Then, like a storm that finally passed, her body eased. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes watered, but no tears fell, not this time. Behind her, Tyler let out a slow breath. Nate nodded quietly, like someone who'd just seen justice for the first time in real life. Vin faced the staff. "You all deserve better than what you've endured. This place will change, starting now." Emily's voice, quiet but firm, broke the silence. "What if it happens again, somewhere else?" Vin stepped closer. "Then we stop it again, together." In that moment, a door didn't just close behind them. A new one opened. A new dawn for Emily. The restaurant had quieted, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with emotion. The kind that lives in the spaces where truth has finally been spoken. Something had shifted. You could feel it in the way the air no longer tensed around every movement, in the way the staff no longer looked over their shoulders. Vin stepped fully into the light of the dining floor. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, taking it in. These young workers who had been surviving in the shadows, some barely holding on, now standing with their eyes locked on him. Not with fear, with hope. Emily stood near the server station, her apron wrinkled from anxious hands, her eyes still wet but focused now. For the first time that night, she wasn't trying to shrink herself. She was simply standing. Vin walked up to her slowly. "It's over," he said softly. "He won't touch this place again." Emily blinked, her lips trembling. I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I did," Vin said, "and I still do." She looked at him, and her voice cracked just slightly as she asked, "Why did you even come tonight?" Vin smiled gently. "Because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to work under someone who sees you as less than human. And because I've seen too many people stay silent for too long." Emily let out a shaky breath. Then something remarkable happened. Her hand, which had been clenched all night, opened, not in surrender, but in release. Behind her, Tyler stood motionless. His mouth parted like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Nate stepped closer too, rubbing his forearm like he wasn't sure what to do with his own relief. Vin turned to face the full team. The cooks had stepped out of the kitchen now. Hosts leaned forward by the front podium, every eye on him. "This place," Vin said, his voice filling the room, "isn't just a restaurant, it's your second home. And home is supposed to be safe." No one spoke, they didn't need to. From now on, no one will be left in the dark. No more secrets behind office doors. No more fear at the end of every shift. Tyler finally stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "You're really gonna change it." Vin looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not going to, we are." He turned back to Emily. "You stood through more than anyone should have to, but you're still here. And now, your voice is part of how this place grows." Emily swallowed hard, nodded slowly, then whispered, "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." "They won't," Vin promised. "Not while I'm breathing." He looked across the room once more, making sure every face felt seen. "This place is yours now. We're going to change it together." And in that moment, what had once been a place of silent suffering became something else entirely. A beginning. Breaking the system. The restaurant remained still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The predator was gone, but the scars he left behind still lingered in the air. People weren't just recovering from a man. They were waking up to something bigger. Tyler stepped forward first. He wasn't loud. He didn't raise his voice. but every word he said felt like it was spoken on behalf of every underpaid worker, every overlooked voice. "Sir," he said cautiously, "I don't mean to overstep, but this wasn't just about Rick." Vin turned toward him, listening. Tyler looked down at his hands, then back up. "It's the way things are run here, the fear, the pressure. People are afraid to speak up because they know they're replaceable." Nate added from across the room, "We work long hours, we miss breaks. Some nights we stay until 1 in the morning without a single thank you. And if we say something, we're told we're not tough enough." Vin nodded slowly. "You've all been surviving a system, not just a man." Emily's voice came from behind them, soft but certain. "I wanted to leave so many times. But every time I looked at my mom's prescriptions, or the rent notice taped to the door, I stayed." She turned to Vin. "I don't want anyone else to go through this, not here, not anywhere." Vin looked across the room, at the line cooks with flour on their aprons, at the hostesses gripping clipboards too tightly, at the young servers who'd learned to smile through exhaustion. And he knew change had to go deeper. "This ends now," he said. "Not just Calloway, not just tonight. We're going to break the cycle." He paced slowly like he was thinking out loud. "We'll bring in third-party auditors. I'll create a direct, anonymous line for every employee to speak up. No more whispers in the break room. If something's wrong, you'll have a place to be heard." Tyler nodded. "We need fair schedules, too. Some of us are juggling school, family, and 2 jobs." "You'll get them," Vin said. "And regular feedback, real feedback, not intimidation." He turned back to Emily. "You said you didn't want anyone else to suffer. I want you to help build what comes next." Her voice cracked. "Me. Yes, you've lived it. That makes your voice more valuable than anyone in a suit." She stood a little taller, unsure at first, but growing steadier by the second. "I'll do it," she said, "whatever it takes." Vin nodded. "We don't just fix buildings when they break, we fix the foundation." And with that, the system that once thrived in silence began to crumble, because someone finally listened. When a black man listens, change begins. The night had deepened outside TORX, the streets slick from a light drizzle, catching the orange glow of streetlights like scattered fire. Inside, the restaurant stood still, emptied of guests but full of something else now, something quiet, something whole. Vin remained at a corner table, alone, elbows on wood worn from years of elbows before him. He watched the final moments of the shift unfold, no longer the hush of survival, but the soft release of relief. Emily exited first, her coat pulled tight, hair damp with sweat and mist. She wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She walked with the kind of silence that follows storms. Behind her, Tyler locked the side entrance, then tossed a dish towel over his shoulder with a chuckle that was more real than any sound he'd made earlier that day. Nate came last, holding the door open for a few line cooks, his voice teasing light. They looked back at Vin one last time, not for approval, but in shared understanding. A nod, a look, a quiet thank you. Vin exhaled and leaned back. His thoughts weren't stuck in that office or on the manager who just lost everything. They were somewhere deeper, because he knew the truth. This story wasn't just about a restaurant. It wasn't just about one predator in a pressed shirt and polished shoes. This was about the quiet way power creeps in through cracks in the system. About how many more Emilys were still clocking in somewhere else, still swallowing fear just to survive the night. Vin had seen it in film sets, in production houses, in trailer lots. He'd seen it in rooms where young black creatives pitched their hearts to tables full of executives who never looked them in the eye. He'd seen it in crew members doing double the work for half the recognition, heads bowed, waiting for a break that never came. He knew what leadership was supposed to be, not dominance, not silence. Not pretending everything's fine if the numbers look good. Leadership was standing up when no one else would, taking the heat, listening before speaking, stepping aside when someone else's voice needed to be heard louder than yours. His father taught him that, a man who worked with cracked hands and a quiet spirit, a man who never had a title but moved like a giant. His mother reinforced it, a woman who taught him that black dignity wasn't loud but unbreakable. And now here he was, not as a celebrity, not as a name on a sign, but as a man who decided not to walk away when it would have been easier. As the last light in the dining room flickered low, Vin stood and walked to the front window. The city rolled on outside, unaware of what had just been undone inside. But he knew, too many suffer in silence. Too many cry behind closed doors and return to work like nothing happened. But if you're willing to listen, if you're brave enough to see what others ignore, then you can help break the cycle. That night, the restaurant didn't just close its doors. It opened something far more important. Sometimes all it takes is one person who chooses to listen. Not with judgment, not with noise, but with heart. Tonight wasn't just about one young woman finding her voice. It was about what happens when dignity is defended, when silence is broken, and when real leadership chooses responsibility over ego. This story reminds us, there are still too many rooms where fear hides behind closed doors. Too many people who stay quiet just to survive. But change doesn't come from power. It comes from courage, from compassion, from listening. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one of them. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe to Black Unbreakable for more stories that matter. In our next videos, we'll continue bringing you the powerful, untold stories of Black lives, stories of struggle, injustice, resilience, and triumph. Stories that the world needs to hear. Stories that will stay with you. Until next time, keep your heart open and your spirit unbreakable.